and we did not go into great detail about the later conquest after he passed through Palestine. And the reason for that is our focus is on the development of the Jewish world as it comes from the Old Testament down to the New. Now, that's not to say that Alexander's further conquests to the east don't affect the Jews, because there was a large population of Jews in Babylon that had stayed behind when the other of their brethren came back and repopulated Palestine upon the reign of Cyrus. And I read something interesting this week that I had never considered before. But the writer I was reading said that it was primarily the very fervent and the predominantly poor who went back with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah to repopulate Palestine. And he made the point that people who are living comfortably very rarely pull up stakes and move. And it was the case that by the end of the Babylonian captivity, there were a number of the Jews who were doing quite well in Babylon. And they were living quite comfortably, and so a great many of them stayed behind. And the ones that stayed behind tended to be Jews of more wealth and means. And so while many of them sent financial contributions to the project, they stayed behind. And so the population of Jews that remained in Babylon was both large and pretty well financed. And so they would become very influential. The practice of building synagogues was one that came back to Palestine with the Jews who came from Babylon. It moved to Egypt, and tonight we'll talk about when that may have taken place, so that in the three major population zones that we have in this period of time for Jews, you have this practice of building synagogues that we really don't know anything about in most of the Old Testament. And again, that grew out of necessity that they had during the Babylonian captivity, because one, the temple was destroyed, so they couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't offer sacrifices, and so the priesthood wasn't able to function as a priesthood. There was no altar of incense on which to offer incense. They couldn't observe the feasts of the Jewish calendar, again, because those revolved around the temple and the offering of sacrifices and things of that nature. So the entire priestly class is by necessity essentially out of work while there is no temple. Okay? And so the Jews were faced with a choice. Do we simply lose our identity as a people and assimilate in among the people that we find ourselves living among? Or do we do something proactive to hold on to our identity? And they chose the latter. They decided to begin meeting on Sabbath days, and I think it seems to have been a widespread awareness among the Jewish exiles that one of the major contributing factors to God allowing them to go into exile was related to the vast ignorance of the people, just the everyday average Joe, with regard to God's law. Up until the time of the Babylonian captivity, it seems that the ordinary Jews sort of took the point of view that it was the priest's job to know the law and to sort of guide them whenever they had interactions with the priests and tell them what to do. But the ordinary person didn't really need to have a very thorough knowledge of the law of Moses. Now that's directly contrary to what God had taught them, wasn't it? Remember back in Deuteronomy chapter 6 when Moses is addressing the generation that would follow Joshua into the land and populate Palestine for the first time, and he said you're to teach it to your children. You're to talk of it when you lie down and when you rise up, when you walk in the way, when you sit in your house. You're to bind it on your wrists and before your eyes. You're to write it on the doorpost and the lintels in your house. He intended for the ordinary people to be well versed in the law, but the fact was they simply weren't. And I think they began to perceive in the captivity that a part of the problem that had led to them being in captivity was they were woefully ignorant of the law. Remember, Hosea said, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And their ignorance of the law had played a major part in the syncretism that they were practicing, where they would take the idol gods of the land and they'd worship them, and then when a feast day came, they'd run down to Jerusalem and they'd pretend to worship God. And God had said over and over through his prophets, that won't work. But they didn't listen. And so the people began to, as a people, make efforts, proactive efforts, to be knowledgeable about the law. And there sprang up some people who would explain the law to them in their Sabbath day meetings, in the synagogues. They would come together. Synagogue is just a Greek word that means to gather together. And so they would come together on the Sabbath day, they would sing the Psalms, they would read the Scriptures, and then somebody would ordinarily explain the Scriptures to them, probably more along the lines of a lecture than a sermon the way we think of it. It was more of the idea of let's read a passage and then let's explain what it means. That became doubly important as the people became less and less fluent in the Hebrew of the law of Moses. And they began to speak Aramaic more and more so that it wasn't the spoken language of the people. Well, they moved to Palestine. They bring that practice with them. And even after they rebuilt the temple, every little town had a synagogue in it. And as a part of their proactive efforts to make sure that the people didn't lose touch with the law again, they began to have what they called synagogue schools. And so the children would go to synagogue during the week, and they would be taught how to read and write using the law of Moses. They would be educated in the fundamental educational curriculum of the day at the synagogue. So it was a central part of Jewish life that we read about in the New Testament, and we may be scratching our head going, where'd that come from? Because we didn't read about it in the Old Testament. Well, it comes to Palestine, and all of this is now affected by the conquest of Alexander. Because Alexander brings with him the Greek language and the Greek culture. And that is going to be revolutionary for the world in which the Jews are living. All right, so now let's get into a little bit about what happens after Alexander. Of course, Alexander dies a young man in 323. Remember that his campaign began in about 336. That's being generous, really about 333. So it was a 10-year campaign in which he took over essentially the known civilized world, and then died in Babylon at the age of about 33, 34. All right, he dies. And in 323, right after his death, there's a meeting of the most important of his generals. And they meet in Babylon. And the purpose of this meeting is to figure out what do we do with the empire that Alexander has conquered. Now, he has left a brother as sort of regent back home in Macedonia, but his brother is mentally ill. And everyone recognizes that Alexander's brother is in no way fit to be ruler of the empire. So they may allow him to remain as regent in name only, but nobody's going to let him do the business of governing. He has a son that is as yet unborn. In other words, his wife was pregnant when he died. And that son was the presumptive heir to the empire. However, Alexander had a cadre of generals and bodyguards that he surrounded himself with, and he was very careful during his lifetime never to allow them to have any specific rank among themselves, but rather whenever he had important tasks, he would assign them to them, and they were in the habit of meeting with him on a regular basis, hoping to be assigned some important task. But they never knew exactly which task he was going to give to whom, and he did that on purpose so that there wouldn't develop a hierarchy among his closest, most trusted confidants. And so it's these confidants who come together in Babylon, and naturally they're squabbling. I won't belabor the point. There's a lot of history here, but the short version is this. They settled on looking at the empire and saying, look, the last people to rule this most of this area of land, let's go back and look at it. Most of this land was ruled by the Persians, and the Persians already had in place a system of organizing government. They called them satrapies. In other words, little governorships that the entire empire was divided up into. And so they said, let's take these most trusted of Alexander's men and make them satraps of these different regions, and they will rule in the name of Alexander's heir in their local sphere of responsibility. So that was ostensibly the plan. As it turned out, let me get back. I meant to go back to that map, by the way. Sorry, I jumped ahead. As it turned out, in 322, these confidants that are known as the Diadochi, they go to war with one another because nobody's happy with the land they've got, except one guy. And this guy I find to be extremely interesting. Ptolemy I, who's later known as Ptolemy Soter, is very interesting in that initial discussion, he secured for himself the satrapy of Egypt, which was smart. Egypt was wealthy. Egypt was also geographically somewhat isolated from the others, so that it was pretty well secure from ambush from his brethren, things like that. It also had great seaports. It had all kinds of resources. And it was also second only to Greece itself, probably the most prominent and important. So he gets that. And from there until he dies, Ptolemy always makes sure that he keeps Egypt safe. He might venture out and try to take some additional land, but he never will commit all of his resources to any venture. He always makes sure to keep what he has. And that was a smart move on his part. There's a lot of history here, but the short version is it gets divided up among these four men primarily. Ptolemy, who gets Egypt, Antigonus, who gets Persia, Babylon, Syria, and Asia Minor, most of the land. Lysimachus gets Thrace, and by the way, on the map, Antigonus is essentially the yellow. Ptolemy, of course, is the blue down there, Egypt. Lysimachus is the orange, and then Cassander gets Macedonia. That's the most important as the Greeks view it, because that was Alexander's homeland. Cassander gets Macedonia. All right. Antigonus gets ambitious, and he begins to try to expand his land, which leads to more wars, 20 years of war. And it ultimately leads to an alliance of the other three against him. And Ptolemy had a general named Seleucus, who had also somewhere in the mix been named the satrap of Babylon, but had not been able to actually take Babylon because Antigonus was sitting on it. But he was a brilliant general in war. And so he took advantage of an opportunity to go and take Babylon, and then he begins to help the alliance to defeat Antigonus one time after another. Now they get Antigonus tied up over to the west, and Seleucus makes another very, very smart strategic move. He plows east as far as he can, all the way to the Punjab region of India, and he makes a deal. In fact, he makes a marriage contract with the ruler of that part of India in exchange for 500 war elephants and their drivers and handlers. Now that's brilliant, because the Greeks rely on essentially three elements militarily. Navy on the seas, and on land it was infantry and cavalry, and the cavalry was horseback mounted. Horses are terrified of elephants. And they already knew this because they had fought the Indians before with horses, and they knew what horses and elephants did to one another. And so Seleucus is able to bring these war elephants back west and to win some very strategic battles, because Antigonus's cavalry can't outflank the elephants. They just won't do it. When they get close to the elephants, they frighten and they run away and they break ranks and they do all of these things. And so he's able to put the elephants in the flanks and then just essentially mow down the armies of Antigonus. When Antigonus is finally defeated, Seleucus ends up with most of his land. So now you have it divided among these four who are ruling the land. Now, Ptolemy effectively controls Palestine. And that's an interesting development as well, because Egypt is really his home base. Let's look at that a minute. Initially in 323, the Babylonian settlement names Ptolemy the satrap of Egypt. In 321, Ptolemy makes a smart move. This fellow named Perdiccas was initially named to be the regent that was going to rule in Alexander's stead. And he takes Alexander's body, and his intention was to take it back to Macedonia to be buried. Now, the Greeks had a tradition that whenever someone conquered another ruler, the way you cemented your rulership over the one you had conquered was you take his body and you bury it. Well, Ptolemy intercepts Perdiccas on his way back to Macedonia, takes the body of Alexander, hauls it down to Egypt, and buries it there, saying to all of Greek culture, I am the successor to Alexander. Now, he never was the successor in the sense of controlling the empire, but he set himself up in a highly prestigious position by doing that. All right? In 318, he annexed Palestine and Syria. Why would he do that? Well, number one, Palestine and Syria are really the only land route to get to Egypt from the east. If he controls them, then he's got a buffer zone if anyone tries to march on Egypt, where he can stop them. All right? Secondly, of course, as we've talked about before, there's a great trade route that runs through Palestine. And the more you control of that trade route and the port cities along the Mediterranean Sea, the more you can make money on taxing the sales and trades and things that go on there. All right? So he annexes that. Ptolemy and Seleucus, being allies, defeat Demetrius I. Demetrius was the son of Antigonus. They defeat Demetrius in the Battle of Gaza. And then Ptolemy goes and he aids the island of Rhodes in breaking a siege that Demetrius puts on them there. Now, that's important because, number one, he gets this name, Soter, which means Savior, from helping to break that siege. But number two, this also adds to his prestige. As a matter of fact, have you ever heard of the Colossus of Rhodes? It was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was a massive statue that was built on the island of Rhodes. There are different accounts of the reason why it was built, but at least one of the ancient accounts was that it was built in honor of the victory that was won with the help of Ptolemy in defeating Demetrius and freeing the people of Rhodes. And so he's gained a lot of popularity in doing that. Okay? Then in 301, the final battle of the fighting among the Diadochi takes place, and it's the Battle of Ipsus. Ptolemy pretty much stays at home and protects his lands. It's the other three that win that battle. And they divide up the land, and Seleucus gets most of it, and in their divisions, Seleucus gets Palestine and Syria. However, Ptolemy is in possession of it. You ever heard the old saw, possession is 99% of the law? Well, that, and coupled with the fact that Seleucus at times had been protected by Ptolemy, and they were friends and allies, meant that during his lifetime, Seleucus never attempted to contest Ptolemy controlling that land. And so Ptolemy had it by possession, Seleucus had it by decree. And that's going to end up leading to a whole lot of strife for the Jews. Okay? Now, the second generation of rulers, all right? Ptolemy the first is succeeded by Ptolemy the second. Very creative people when it comes to naming their children. Now, this one is Ptolemy Philadelphus. Anybody know what Philadelphus means?
Brotherly love.
Yeah, brother lover, essentially. The idea of he loved his brethren. He was co-regent with his father for the last 2 years that Ptolemy I lived. Now, one thing I should tell you about Ptolemy I, in addition to being a brilliant general, he was a great patron of learning. As a matter of fact, Pythagoras, the famous Greek mathematician and scientist, his patron was Ptolemy. And legend says that Ptolemy tried to study Pythagoras' geometry and was really struggling with it and complained to Pythagoras and said, "Why is this so difficult?" And Pythagoras replied, "My lord, there is no royal road to learning geometry." He might have been onto something there. But at any rate, he had patronized Pythagoras. Ptolemy II continued that tradition. You've heard about the great Library of Alexandria? That was primarily begun under the reign of Ptolemy II. There was also it looks like Mouseion. It's the word we get our word museum from. it was more than what we consider a museum now. It was a place of learning. In addition to housing all kinds of artifacts and things, it was also a place where teaching took place. He also built the lighthouse, the great lighthouse on the island of Pharos. And he did a lot of things. In fact, he probably brought Egypt to its height under the Ptolemies. He was involved in the First Syrian War. This is the first conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids over Palestine and Syria. Okay? And he lost a region called Cyrenaica. Now, I want to talk about that just a moment. Cyrenaica is a portion of what we know today as Libya, and particularly the portion that is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. You get much south of the Mediterranean Sea, what kind of land are you into? Desert, yeah. So it wasn't very heavily populated very far south. But there was one important city in particular called Cyrene that was owned and operated by the Ptolemies. As a matter of fact, Ptolemy I, when he had taken possession of Palestine, had taken 120,000 Jews captive into Egypt, at least according to Josephus. And apparently he treated them so well that Josephus said a great many of other Jews voluntarily moved to Egypt. And Ptolemy had a very high regard for the Jews because they were very much attached to their word. In other words, if they took an oath, they were very, very conscientious about performing it. And so he realized if he could get these people to be mercenaries and take an oath to fight on his behalf, that they'd die before they would betray him. And so he set up outposts of Jewish mercenaries all over his empire, and he commissioned a particular group of them to go and conquer this Cyrenaica region, including the city of Cyrene in northern Libya, to add on to his empire. As a matter of fact, one of the historians that wrote in that time mentioned that of the 4 biggest populations in the city of Cyrene, the Jews were one of them. Now, why is Cyrene ringing a bell to you? Anybody know?
Simon of Cyrene.
That's exactly right. The man who was compelled to carry the cross of Jesus, Simon of Cyrene, was very likely from this city that was populated with Jews during the period between the Testaments. Okay? Ptolemy II lost it to his brother, who was supposed to be governing it on behalf of the family, and decided while Ptolemy was tied up in the Syrian war, he would break away and establish his own independent kingdom there in Cyrenaica. And Ptolemy II was never able to get it back during his lifetime. He was also involved in the Cremontian War. Say that 5 times fast. And the Second Syrian War. We'll talk about those later. Now, his counterpart among the Seleucids is Antiochus I, Soter. This is the son of Seleucus. Okay? He ruled the Seleucid Empire from the death of his father until his own death in 261. He was at war in 278 with Gauls in Anatolia. Now, what do you know about Gauls? I heard something.
From the Orient.
Loud.
French.
Yeah, well, see, here's the thing. The Gauls migrated from Asia into the northern part of Asia Minor, and there they became known as the Galatians. And then they migrated farther east into what came to be known as Gaul, which we know today is a large part of France. As a matter of fact, when Julius Caesar wrote his book on the Gallic Wars, he was referring to wars in the region we know as France. In fact, I believe the opening line in Latin is Gallia est omni diviso in partes tres, which means Gaul is all divided into 3 parts. And he begins to talk about the geography of Gaul. So they migrated from Asia to Asia Minor to France to the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, to the British Isles, where they're known as Gaelic, Celtic peoples, and from there to Virginia. And a lot of us have Gaulish blood flowing in our veins, okay? But when you read the letter to the Galatians, these are the people we're talking about. They invaded during the reign of Antiochus I, and he goes to war with them in 278. Doesn't turn out very well for him. And he comes back home, and there's a whole strife that we're not going to get into tonight for the sake of time, but the Syrian wars begin. Okay? I want to talk for a few moments that are left. This is a map, the Ptolemaic kingdom to the south, the Seleucid to the north, and Palestine in the middle. I want to talk for the moments we have left about what life is like for the Jews who are living under the first two Ptolemies. Okay? As we said, Ptolemy I had led 120,000 captives into Egypt. This would have been Palestinian Jews, right? Leads them into Egypt. Now you've got this population that's already in Egypt that migrated there in the time of Jeremiah, swelling and growing. All right. Then he sends Jewish mercenaries to Libya, and then Ptolemy II frees all of those captives that remain captive when he becomes the king of Egypt. Under Ptolemy II, I had already told you he liked to patronize the arts, but the Septuagint translation is begun under him. Now, what is the Septuagint translation?
Greek translation.
What's that?
Greek translation of the Old Testament.
That's right. It's a translation of the Old Testament into Greek, and we talk about it oftentimes as if it were a single work. It actually wasn't. There were several different versions of the Septuagint. The Torah was translated as a body, as best we can tell, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But then after that, remember, the Old Testament to Jews was divided into 3 sections. You had the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Okay? And the prophets and the writings were not necessarily translated in bulk, but book by book. And not all of them were translated in Egypt. And as I said, there were some different translations floating around, so it wasn't necessarily a unified work the way we tend to think of it. But there was enough of it that many of our New Testament writers quote from Septuagint Bibles versus going back to the Old Testament and quoting Hebrew. Yes, sir?
But you find it a bit ironic that Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, Ptolemy led them back to Egypt in captivity.
And not only Ptolemy, they went back voluntarily 2 or 3 times. Yeah, that's right. All right. Jews actually held an annual celebration on the island of Pharos, where the great lighthouse was, to celebrate the translating of the law into Greek. Now, think about this. Large population of Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt. Very cosmopolitan group of people, highly educated, came to be quite wealthy, known far and wide for their business acumen. And the Ptolemies treated them very kindly. In fact, pretty much allowed them to be self-governing. They had sort of their own quarter of the city in Alexandria. And Strabo even mentions that they had their own ethnarch who essentially acted almost like a king in their little population, making rules and laws, deciding disputes, things of that nature. And Ptolemy let that take place. Ptolemy II also built and reinforced a number of cities in Palestine because he was at war with the Nabateans. Anybody know who the Nabateans are?
Is it Petra?
What's that?
Is it Petra? Is that the city of Petra?
That was a Nabatean civilization.
Yeah.
They were primarily nomadic Arabs that he's at war with. And he realizes that if he builds up and fortifies Palestine, that keeps the Nabateans from getting across the Sinai Peninsula and into Egypt. But in the process, what he's done is to enrich and build up the cities of Palestine so people begin to move there. If you build it, they will come. Yeah, that happened. And Palestine begins to grow in population because it's now becoming a nice place to live. All right, so that's Jews through Ptolemies 1 and 2. Still a lot of history, only about 100 years, but we'll try to pick up there next time. Thank you so much for your attention.